The conflict between the United States and Iran, alongside the looming closure of the Strait of Hormuz, has brought a sixth oil shock right to our doorstep. Over 50 years have passed since the first crisis erupted in 1973. Today, everyone talks about artificial intelligence, yet crude oil remains the true force driving human civilization forward. Historically, the world has faced 5 major oil shocks, and each time, global order was forcefully reshaped. Industrial dominance shifted, living habits transformed, some fell into ruin, while others amassed immense wealth. History repeats itself continuously, and examining past footprints allows us to anticipate the coming storm and prepare accordingly. The fighting itself might end sooner than expected, but the scars left on energy prices will linger much longer. Once a market experiences a shock of this magnitude, returning to baseline is a grueling process. Many people hope that a simple peace declaration will restore everything to normal, but history proves that expectation false. Critical infrastructure like oil fields and refineries has sustained direct damage. Rebuilding those shattered facilities requires immense capital, technical expertise, and above all time. According to a recent report from the International Energy Agency, this conflict has triggered the largest supply disruption in history. Looking back at past crises, recovering production levels and stabilizing prices after a supply chain breakdown of this scale took at least 2 years. Of course, the current landscape has a few advantages that did not exist during earlier shocks. Strategic petroleum reserves are now in place, and alternatives such as electric vehicles and renewable energy have gained ground. Major economies have also established joint response frameworks under international organizations, which can help cushion the immediate blow. Nevertheless, these buffer mechanisms are still far from enough to fully cover the massive void left by the Middle East, leaving the world vulnerable as an energy deficit hits. While global alarm grows, conditions inside South Korea appear deceptively calm on the surface. There are no endless lines at gas stations and no signs of panic buying. Several factors explain this phenomenon. First, the South Korean government operates an exceptionally aggressive flexible fuel tax system, cutting taxes that normally make up nearly half the price at the pump to artificially suppress rising import costs. At the same time, state-owned utility companies like South Korea's electric power and gas corporations are absorbing massive debt to hold retail prices down. Prices remain stable not because the market is safe, but because public entities are borrowing against their future to shield citizens from the immediate impact. South Korea's industrial and residential structures have also evolved since the early days. Although the nation lacks indigenous crude reserves, it operates world-class advanced oil refining facilities, effectively acting as an onshore refinery powerhouse. This setup grants cost competitiveness and allows the country to diversify supply routes away from heavy Middle Eastern reliance. The nation also maintains substantial storage reserves. Furthermore, dense high-rise residential areas, combined with high-efficiency home appliances, keep energy consumption relatively lean. While current conditions hold steady, this artificial stability cannot last forever because those hidden costs never truly disappear. As the conflict drags on, the burden will eventually manifest as higher taxes, soaring utility bills, and broad price hikes. To understand where this leads, we must travel back to 1973, when the first oil shock erupted. That year shattered every routine that modern society took for granted. The illusion that oil was as limitless as the air we breathe collapsed, forcing the world to adapt rapidly to survive the shortfall. To keep the timeline clear, while historians often focus specifically on the 2 major spikes of the 1970s, this overview connects 5 key energy crises into one continuous narrative. In October 1973, the Fourth Arab-Israeli War broke out, leading Arab oil-producing nations to impose a strict oil embargo on countries supporting Israel. Within a few short months, global crude prices surged from $3 to $12 per barrel. The world sank into unprecedented stagflation, prompting governments to intervene directly in markets and enforce physical limits on public activity. The United States slashed highway speed limits from 75 miles per hour to 55 miles per hour and implemented year-round daylight saving time to maximize daylight hours. Several European countries, including the Netherlands, banned Sunday driving altogether. Empty highways were quickly filled by bicycles, roller skates, and horse-drawn carriages. This exact moment transformed Amsterdam from a congested motor city into the world-renowned cycling hub it is today, as citizens pushed for dedicated bike lanes and reshaped the urban landscape. Retail habits shifted just as dramatically. Soaring fuel costs forced Americans to abandon frequent drives to distant shopping centers in favor of small neighborhood stores nearby. This shift laid the groundwork for the rapid expansion of convenience store chains like 7-Eleven. The first shock delivered a painful lesson to humanity. Oil was no longer just a commercial product, but a formidable weapon. Those who controlled energy held the power to dictate global order, and when energy ran scarce, governments would not hesitate to curtail individual freedoms. While the first crisis warned against the weaponization of resources, the second oil shock in 1979 acted as a brutal forced restructuring of the global economy. The Iranian Revolution overthrew the pro-American monarchy and halted oil exports, and the subsequent outbreak of the Iran-Iraq War completely severed a vital supply line. Prices that hovered around $13 quickly escalated toward $40 per barrel. World markets plunged back into stagflation, with prices climbing while economic growth stalled. To halt this spiral, the United States took a drastic path. Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker implemented a harsh policy by raising benchmark interest rates to 20%, an event remembered as the Volcker shock. It marked the first time people realized that surging oil prices could directly trigger crushing mortgage and loan rates. Caught between sky-high oil prices and historic interest rates, countless businesses went bankrupt, while emerging industrial nations faced severe economic contractions. This shift overturned entire industries. Heavy American gas guzzlers fell out of favor, opening the door for fuel-efficient Japanese compact cars to dominate the market. In consumer electronics, Japanese firms like Sony and Panasonic led the globe with compact, energy-efficient designs. The label "Made in Japan" shed its cheap reputation and became synonymous with reliability and high performance. On the domestic front, suburban living, a cornerstone of the American dream, took a direct hit. High commuting costs forced middle-class families back toward urban centers or transit-accessible neighborhoods. The convenience store model expanded rapidly beyond the United States into Japan, becoming a central pillar of retail. Ultimately, the second shock confronted households with a fundamental question: were their assets truly safe from rising fuel prices and skyrocketing interest rates? By 1990, the third oil shock erupted directly within the producing regions when Iraq invaded Kuwait and set fire to hundreds of oil wells, poking a massive hole in global supply practically overnight. Crude prices doubled from $10 to $40 per barrel in a matter of months. This crisis forced nations to redefine energy security, shifting the perception of oil from a standard market commodity to a critical survival resource that must be stockpiled. To maintain national stability, governments expanded their strategic petroleum reserves so they would have emergency stockpiles during times of crisis. Meanwhile, the deployment of an international coalition, led by the United States to protect Middle Eastern shipping lanes, signaled that energy routes were no longer just a matter of diplomacy, but a core military priority. The fourth oil shock in 2008 took on an entirely different character. Unlike earlier crises, it was not caused by war or revolution, but by skyrocketing demand in emerging economies like China and India, combined with massive speculative capital in financial markets. Prices spiked to an all-time high of $147 per barrel, turning crude into a volatile financial asset. The most striking consequence was the steep decline of distant suburban developments. Many economists point to surging gasoline prices as a major trigger behind the 2008 global financial crisis. American families had used subprime mortgages to buy large homes far from city centers, only to be crushed when mortgage rates jumped alongside unbearable daily fuel costs. Yet those exorbitant energy costs spurred technological breakthroughs. The United States began investing heavily in shale oil extraction, drilling deep into dense rock formations to unleash vast new reserves. This surge catapulted America back into position as the world's top crude producer, while research into biofuels made from corn and sugarcane gained serious momentum. In 2022, the fifth shock arrived with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, completely redrawing the global energy map. As Russia cut gas pipelines to Europe and Western nations, halted Russian oil imports, energy flows ceased to follow simple market efficiency. Instead, trade aligned along geopolitical fault lines. Europe scrambled to replace decades of reliance on cheap Russian pipeline gas with shipments of liquefied natural gas. From the United States and Qatar, energy policies transformed overnight as solar, wind, and nuclear power shifted from long-term environmental goals into immediate tools for national self-defense. The drive for energy independence overtook carbon neutrality as the primary engine for new investment, establishing a harsh new reality. Oil and gas were no longer freely traded goods, but strategic assets accessible mainly through political alignment. Looking across all 5 oil shocks, the triggers varied, but the chain reaction followed a strikingly consistent pattern, knocking down everyday routines like a falling line of dominoes. The first domino to fall is always transportation costs. Airfare fuel surcharges adjust rapidly, sparking public anxiety over impending price hikes. The burden quickly spreads to shipping lines and trucking fleets, creating widespread supply delays. The second domino is broad inflation. Prices rise across the board, rather than in isolated categories, hitting groceries, manufactured goods, and basic electricity bills. In the third stage, central banks step in to curb runaway inflation by raising interest rates sharply. Crushed by rising debt payments, households tighten their spending, causing consumer demand to plummet. The fourth domino brings corporate downsizing and job insecurity. Facing weak sales, companies cut investments and freeze hiring to survive, bringing the crisis straight to individual households. These initial stages represent the short-term shock, which eventually gives way to long-term structural changes. In the fifth stage, people adapt by switching to smaller vehicles, relocating closer to work, reducing travel, and spending locally. Businesses that fail to streamline their operations simply do not survive. Finally, the sixth stage establishes a new economic baseline where lean, energy-efficient industries emerge as the new leaders. This sequence, rising freight rates, inflation, interest rate hikes, reduced spending, job cuts, lifestyle shifts, and industrial overhaul, has remained virtually unchanged throughout history. It consistently brings stagflation, aggressive rate hikes, forced industrial retooling, and a surge in alternative energy investments. The impending sixth crisis will likely follow this established track, but the modern digital landscape will dramatically accelerate its speed and destructive power. For a nation heavily dependent on digital infrastructure like South Korea, these shocks will hit much faster. Past oil shocks paralyzed factories and physical transport, but the next crisis threatens to freeze the digital engine of the future. While earlier eras used oil to run machinery and drive vehicles, modern energy powers data centers and artificial intelligence. Processing millions of complex calculations requires vast amounts of electricity, which still relies heavily on fossil fuels sensitive to crude price swings. Sustained high oil prices will not only drive up home electricity bills, but will also trigger an explosion in data processing costs. Decades ago, high gas prices meant canceling a road trip. Today, energy shortages risk causing digital blackouts that could paralyze financial networks, public administration, and communications. South Korea occupies a particularly vulnerable position in this ecosystem because its power grid operates as an isolated island, completely disconnected from neighboring countries, with no way to import electricity during shortages. Making matters more intense, the core industries driving South Korea's economy, such as semiconductor manufacturing, steel, petrochemicals, and battery production, are massive power consumers. Running a single semiconductor production line requires as much electricity as a medium-sized city. Consequently, rising energy costs do not merely squeeze corporate profits, they undermine the nation's core export competitiveness. Given that daily transactions and government services are fully digitized, any disruption to the energy supply could collapse societal infrastructure at unprecedented speed. This upcoming crisis serves as a true stress test for whether modern digital society can withstand a major power crunch. The ideal resolution remains simple: halting conflict, repairing trade routes, and restoring market stability before the sixth oil shock fully takes hold. Every party involved understands that this is the best path for global stability, yet executing that simple answer remains the hardest challenge of all.